For more than 250,000 pioneers who braved the trails of the East to get west in the early days of America's iconic migration, there was one challenging place where the cinches of horses were redone, the tongues of wagons were tightened, and dreams were put on hold, and where many desperate prayers were said. That place was the most dreaded crossing in the Appalachians. It was a point days from the starting area in Baltimore. It was a ridge that rose from the rolling fertile plains of Maryland like an omen, a wall telling freedom and land-seeking pioneers to stay and not to cross. It was a sharp ridge that originally was called Sidelong Hill. It was named that for the tenuous nature of the thin shelf-like road over the ridge and the daily, often fatal accidents on the ascent and the way back down on the western side. Since the earliest of days, Native Americans and some brave European pioneers, seeking freedom of many shades in the wideness of the West, found that what would eventually become known as Sidling Hill blocked their way. Many said it's best to go around it than try to go over it. Most chose not to go around it, and the road they took was treacherous. Many were injured, many died. For the drivers of Conestoga wagons, both longtime professionals and first-timers, the trip up and over Sidling Hill was in many ways more horizontal than vertical. As travelers approached from the east side, they made a left turn and then made their way higher and higher in slow increments as one might go diagonally to the top of a flight of very wide stairs. It was the only way. Going straight over the top was impossible. Going diagonal was doable, but dangerous. The Jefferson administration, shortly after Lewis and Clark returned, had pushed through a bill in Congress to fund what would become America's first interstate highway, a path from the east to the growing Midwest. The goal was to connect the port at Baltimore with the city of Cumberland on the Potomac, and eventually connect with the Ohio at Wheeling. From there, the brave would push on, some floating down the Ohio to New Orleans or up other rivers. The path to Wheeling, though, was a patchwork quilt of American Indian trails and early clearings that had been strung together by Congress and called the National Road. Some inventive engineering, though, was attempted. There were pioneering attempts at tunneling. The longest tunnel on the Pennsylvania Turnpike would pierce Sidling Hill, but it was retired in the 70s. For the pioneers heading west from Baltimore on the new National Road, the pace was slow. Most wagons averaged about 12 miles a day at best. Many tiny villages sprung up along the old National Road. They started offering food and wagon repairs and alcohol. A brand new industry was developing in early expanding America, the tavern trade. Many little towns offered a unique assistance. Legendary among them was Clear Spring, a beautiful little town in Maryland that had some of the best drinking water on the early part of the journey. It came bubbling up through an artesian well just a block from the road. Sadly, if you go there today, you'll find the well is closed and has been condemned. All along the old National Road, Congress pumped a ton of money in some of the most up-to-date building techniques that produced a slew of beautiful bridges, such as the Wilson Bridge, and the longest stone arch in the world at the time, over the Castleman River. It was finished in 1806 and carried the National Road and then US 40 until the 1930s. As the 1800s progressed, the old National Road became a good and bad trail, complete with the nearly death-defying crossing at Sidling Hill. But it was narrow, in some places nearly one way. Highway crews in Maryland did get some federal money to upgrade the path. But the old National Road, modern as it may have been for its day, was nothing like a highway of modern times. It was not until the 1930s that anything you could call a modern-day road was carved over the summit at Sidling Hill. That road was improved over the years and is now the right-of-way of old US 40. Except for a short section at the summit, where engineers carved the crossing 70 feet lower than the original crossing, you actually drive on what was the old path. In the 1970s, though, the original crossing at Sidling Hill was bypassed by an amazing cut through the mountain, a blight on the scenery that can be seen for miles. Instead of tunneling through Sidling Hill, the new National Freeway sliced through the mountain. It's dramatic and breathtaking, but it hides the terror and torment of the original crossing just 2 miles to the south. But luckily, most of the old crossing is still visible on old 40. But there is a very missing link, the portion of the old original National Road that wound its way up the east side of the ridge, a precarious trek that lent credence to the mountain's original name, Sidelong Hill. But you can't get there anymore. You can see it on some maps. You can make out the route by looking at aerial photographs. You can even see where the original slippery slope met today's right-of-way, swinging in a big arc and finally heading up the mountain. But a piece of America's first interstate highway system is missing, the 1.5 miles of westward trek that was the most feared and most dreaded by over 250,000 Americans is being held hostage behind a closed gate. For years I have longed to just walk that missing link. Through locals I have contacted the people who are denying access to a world of historians and lovers of the American trek, and I've always gotten the same answer. That road's on private property. Why would you want to see it anyway? Why? Because westward-bound pioneers trekking the old National Road surged ahead, praying aloud as they went up that side of the mountain in a true test of the American spirit. In many ways, the expansion of America was tempered on old Sidelong Hill. It was here, though behind the fence, that the true westward trek began. Sadly, off limits due to the insensitivity of a family that refuses to let lovers of history simply open a gate and see a path that opened the American West. I'm Dennis Daly.